It was a bright Saturday afternoon when the warm sun filtered through the swaying branches of the trees that lined our suburban street. The day had begun as most weekends did, slow and relaxed. There was a familiar quiet in the neighborhood. That made it easy to forget the world beyond our fences and manicured lawns. The kids were outside playing. The air was filled with the sounds of distant laughter and occasional shouts of "catch" or "tag, you're it," as they ran about in their own little games. Birds were chirping in the trees, and the occasional car would drive by, windows down, music playing softly, adding to the soundtrack of suburban life. Inside my home, I had been trying to enjoy the peace while my daughter Emma played in the front yard. Emma was a joyful child, despite the limitations her disability imposed on her life. A little over 4 years old, she had been born with a rare condition that left her reliant on a wheelchair for mobility. It had been a difficult start, but over the years, we had adapted. Emma had grown into an inquisitive, lively soul who never let her disability stop her from exploring the world around her. Her favorite toy was a small stuffed bear, worn at the seams from years of love. She loved to bring it outside, letting it sit in her lap as she spun her wheels in playful circles. My heart swelled every time I saw her smile, her face radiant with innocence and joy, her laughter like music to my ears. It was in these moments that I could almost forget the constant struggle we faced, the stares from strangers, the challenges of maneuvering through the world designed for the able-bodied, and the ongoing battle with bureaucracy to ensure that she received the proper care and accommodations. Emma's laughter, her enthusiasm for life, was always a beacon of light, pushing away the shadows of difficulty. I was standing by the window, sipping my coffee, when I saw her, Karen, the president of our HOA, strolling down the street with her usual air of self-importance. It was hard to miss her. Not just because she was a regular fixture in our neighborhood, but because she exuded an aura of superiority that seemed to make her stand taller, even without heels. Dressed in the latest brand of athleisure, her posture was straight, her expression stern and judgmental. She held a stack of flyers in her hand, likely about the latest set of neighborhood rules that she had decided to enforce. Rules that almost always seemed to lean toward controlling the way others lived. Karen had been the HOA president for as long as I could remember, and in that time, she had grown more and more insufferable. No matter how small or trivial the issue, she had an uncanny ability to take it to the next level, often making others feel as though they were living under the shadow of her watchful eye. She was the kind of person who believed that everything she said and did was for the betterment of the neighborhood. Of course, what she really meant was that she wanted to impose her idea of perfection on everyone else. As she walked past my house, I noticed her glance over toward Emma, who was sitting in her wheelchair, her stuffed bear nestled in her lap. I could see the change in Karen's demeanor immediately. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture. She wasn't just walking by, she was observing, taking note of something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending conflict that would soon be impossible to ignore. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, Emma was just playing outside. What harm could Karen possibly see in that? I had always tried to keep our yard neat, even if it was never pristine enough to meet Karen's standards. But then, I overheard her mutter something under her breath. Her voice was low, but I could hear the venom in her words. "This property is an eyesore," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. I froze, my hand instinctively gripping the mug tighter. It took all my willpower not to march outside right then and confront her. She didn't know I was watching her through the window, but I could see every step she took as she walked toward my driveway. I knew Karen well enough to anticipate what would come next. She wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a woman who found satisfaction in asserting control, especially when she believed she was in the right. As she got closer, Emma noticed her and smiled, offering a friendly wave as she always did with neighbors. But Karen didn't wave back. She didn't even acknowledge Emma's greeting. Instead, her expression darkened, and I saw her eyes flick from Emma's wheelchair to the toys scattered across the yard. A small collection of Emma's things, a colorful ball, a doll lying on its side, a plastic cup from her tea set, had been left out while she played. Nothing more than remnants of a child's afternoon fun. But to Karen, they must have been an affront to her perfect vision of suburban life. Why does she need to be out here in the way? Karen sneered, her voice loud enough for me to hear from. Inside, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen's words were laced with disgust, as if my daughter's mere presence in the yard was some sort of violation. What gave Karen the right to treat Emma this way? To look at her as though she were an inconvenience, an eyesore. My chest tightened with anger, but I stayed where I was for a moment, watching. Karen took a few more steps, now standing in front of Emma, blocking her view of the sky. Emma didn't seem to notice the change in tone, still lost in her own little world. "The fence is too close to the sidewalk," Karen muttered, her finger now pointing at the area where the sidewalk met, the yard. She was always on the lookout for some infraction, something to report, and today she had found it. "And that wheelchair isn't allowed to block it." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. She was going after Emma now, targeting her with all the venom she had stored up from years of petty grievances. Before I could even step outside, Karen had already begun to take action. She reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy-duty chain, the kind used for securing fences or locking up gates. It was a thick metal coil, almost industrial in strength, and my blood ran cold as I saw her move toward Emma's wheelchair with it. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted as I rushed out the door, my feet pounding against the concrete. The words came out more as a desperate plea than a command, as though if I just spoke loud enough I could somehow stop this madness. But Karen didn't flinch. She didn't even look at me. Instead, she kept her focus on Emma, who was still blissfully unaware of what was happening around her. "It's for the betterment of the neighborhood," Karen said with a smile that could only be described as smug, her words dripping with false righteousness. "I'm just making sure everything stays in line. We can't have people causing a disruption, can we?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was chaining my daughter to the fence. Chaining her. My head spun with disbelief. This wasn't just some neighborhood dispute over a lawn ornament or a misplaced trash can. This was an attack on my daughter, an attack on her dignity, her right to be free in her own home. I rushed over, my heart racing. "Take that chain." "Off her!" I demanded, reaching out to grab it. But Karen stood firm, her cold eyes locking with mine. "You need to follow the rules," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You don't want to get the HOA involved, do you?" For a moment, I stood there speechless. I couldn't believe it had come to this. My own daughter, in her wheelchair, was being locked to a fence by this woman who had no compassion, no understanding of the hardship Emma faced every day. And here she was, trying to enforce some twisted version of order at any cost. "You're insane!" I shouted, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. But Karen simply smiled, her satisfaction growing with every passing second. "Better start following the rules," she said, her words almost a taunt. I stood there, seething, unable to process the madness of it all. How had it come to this? How had we gone from peaceful neighbors to this absurd confrontation? What had Karen become? I could feel my hands trembling as I tried to untangle the chain, but Karen just stood there, watching me like a predator eyeing her prey. It felt like hours, though it was probably only moments before I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, what's going on here?" I turned to see another neighbor, Tim, walking down the street, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could see that even he recognized how wrong this situation was. Karen hesitated for just a second, then straightened her posture. "Everything's fine," she said coolly, her voice losing some of its earlier venom. But I could see through the thin veneer of politeness. I wasn't backing down. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The events of that afternoon had shaken me to my core. I had always known Karen could be controlling, but to see her take things so far, to the point of chaining my daughter to the fence, was beyond comprehension. My stomach churned as I relived the moment in my mind. I had been frozen in disbelief, standing there as she casually locked my disabled daughter to the fence, all for a trivial issue about property lines and her warped sense of control. Emma had been so innocent, so unaware of the malicious intent behind Karen's actions. I could see her in my mind's eye, her small hands gripping her stuffed bear, completely oblivious to the tension mounting around her. It made my blood boil. How could anyone, let alone a neighbor, someone who should be looking out for the well-being of others, be so cruel to a child who had done nothing wrong? Emma's disability didn't define her. It didn't make her any less of a person, but to Karen, it seemed like a flaw, an imperfection in the picture she had painted of her perfect little neighborhood. I paced back and forth in my living room, my mind racing, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. My chest tightened, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't just about the chain, or the fence, or the fact that Karen had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. It was about the larger issue, the fact that Karen had become a bully, wielding her power over people she saw as beneath her. I knew I had to do something about it. I couldn't just let this slide. Then, as if a light had clicked on in my mind, I remembered something. Someone. Marcus. Marcus and I had been friends since college. We had met in our first year, both of us in the criminal justice program, and instantly hit it off. He was everything I wasn't, calm, collected, and analytical. He could read a room like no one else, and his ability to stay composed under pressure was something I envied. Over the years, we had stayed close, even after he joined the FBI's Criminal Investigations Division. Whenever I found myself in a tight spot, or when life threw me a curveball I couldn't handle on my own, Marcus was the first person I'd call. He had helped me through more than one rough patch, and I knew he would understand the urgency in my voice when I called him now. I grabbed my phone, my hands still shaking from the events of the afternoon. The call connected quickly, and after 2 rings I heard his familiar voice on the other end. "Marcus," I began, trying to steady my breath. "I need your help. Karen has crossed the line. She's gone too far this time." There was a slight pause, a moment where I could almost hear him processing the words before he responded. "What happened?" he asked, his tone measured, always so calm. I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts before I spoke. I didn't want to sound frantic, even though that's exactly how I felt. I knew that if I didn't explain everything carefully, he might not grasp the severity of the situation. She chained Emma to the fence, Marcus. "Right there in our yard," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She did it because of some stupid HOA rule about the property line, about the sidewalk being too close to the fence. I don't even know how to process it. My daughter, who already has enough to deal with, was locked to the fence like she was some kind of criminal." There was another silence on the line, and I could tell that Marcus was taking in the information. I could hear him shifting in his chair, and I imagined him, rubbing his temple, his way of processing something difficult. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, and I could feel the sincerity in his words. He wasn't just concerned about the situation. He was concerned about me, too. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle. "I'm not sure," I said, honestly. "I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm losing control of everything." "You're not losing control," he reassured me. "We're going to figure this out. We'll handle it. Just take a breath. You're not alone in this. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the storm inside me. Hearing Marcus's voice always had that effect on me. He had a way of making everything seem manageable, even when I felt like the world was collapsing around me. I don't know what to do, I repeated, the frustration seeping back into my voice. Karen has always been bad, but this is different. She's targeting Emma. This isn't just a neighborly disagreement anymore. This is about something deeper. I need to make sure she faces consequences for what she did. She can't just get away with it. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his voice dropping to a serious tone. I understand. And you're right. This isn't just about a chain and a fence. This is harassment. It's an abuse of power, and it's gone too far. I'll help you gather the evidence, and we'll make sure Karen is held accountable for her actions. The words, gather the evidence, sent a jolt of energy through me. This wasn't just about confronting Karen. This was about exposing her for the bully she was. It was about showing the world what she had done and making sure that no one would allow her to get away with it. I had my own moral compass, but I knew that it wasn't enough to simply be right in my own eyes. I needed proof. I needed something concrete that would force others to see Karen for who she truly was. Thanks, Marcus, I said, my voice breaking a little. I don't know what I would do without you. No problem, he replied, his voice firm. I've got your back. I'll look into this from my end and see what I can find. Let's get this figured out the right way. I'll be waiting. To hear from you, I said, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. After hanging up, I paced around the living room for a few minutes, trying to process everything that had just happened. My mind was spinning with questions. How had Karen become so callous? Was she always this cruel, or had something triggered this new level of animosity? And how had I let her get this far without standing up to her before? But I knew that dwelling on these questions wasn't going to solve anything. I had to focus on the task at hand, gathering the evidence, making sure that Karen didn't get away with her actions. It wasn't long before Marcus called me back, his voice as calm as ever. I've done a little digging, and it turns out Karen has quite the history, he said. She's been a problem in the neighborhood for years, but people have been too afraid to speak out. The HOA members are terrified of her, but no one has ever had the courage to stand up to her until now. I felt a wave of anger flood over me. So she's been doing this for years and no one has said anything? Pretty much, Marcus replied. But don't worry, I'm talking to a few people, trying to get more information. I'll see what I can do to get some formal complaints on record. You're not the first person she's targeted. Just give me a little time to dig deeper. I'll be waiting, I said. Let me know what you find. Over the next few days, I did everything I could to document what had happened. I took pictures of the fence, of Emma's wheelchair, and of the chain that Karen had used to bind her. I spoke with neighbors who had witnessed the incident, trying to get as many statements as possible. But I knew that Marcus was the key to making sure this all came to light. When I finally heard back from him, it was everything I had hoped for. And more. I've got what we need, he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. We've got enough evidence now to make this stick. We're going to take this to the HOA, and if they don't act, we'll take it higher. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when the scales would tip in our favor, and Karen's reign of terror would finally come to an end. The days following Karen's cruel actions were a blur of emotion, frustration, and disbelief. At first, I had been overwhelmed, unsure of what steps to take or who to turn to for help. The shock of seeing my disabled daughter chained to the fence by a neighbor who was supposed to look out for us still haunted me. But as time passed, something inside me hardened, something that told me I had to stand up for Emma and for myself. I couldn't let this go, not when Karen had crossed such a horrific line. My first step was reaching out to Marcus, and his help had been invaluable. With his expertise, connections, and unwavering support, we had gathered a formidable case against Karen. It wasn't just about what happened in my front yard anymore. It was about exposing Karen for the toxic presence she had been for years. What I hadn't realized was that Karen's behavior wasn't isolated to just me or my family. This wasn't the first time she had used her HOA position to terrorize a neighbor. In fact, as Marcus dug deeper into the history of Karen's actions, he uncovered a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and power abuse that spanned across the neighborhood. I was still processing all the information when Marcus called me one morning. His voice was calm, professional, as always, but there was a certain edge to it. I could tell that he had something significant to share. "Hey, I've got something for you," he began. "I managed to track down some footage from the security. Cameras in the neighborhood. You're not going to like what you see, but it's undeniable evidence that Karen locked Emma to the fence." My stomach dropped as I absorbed his words. Part of me had hoped that there was some sort of misunderstanding, that Karen hadn't really gone that far. But now, hearing it from Marcus, I knew the truth was much worse than I had feared. "I'm going to send you the footage. It's clear as day. Karen walks right up to Emma and locks her in place, no hesitation, no remorse." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Karen could no longer hide behind her arrogance and her position as the HOA president. This was not just a neighborly dispute anymore. It was an act of cruelty, an abuse of power, and I had the evidence to prove it. When Marcus sent the footage, I could hardly bring myself to watch it. Part of me wanted to avoid it, to pretend it hadn't happened, but I knew I had to face the truth. I clicked play. The video was grainy, but clear enough to make out the scene. Karen, in all her pompous glory, marched down the street toward my house, a determined look on her face. Emma was sitting in her wheelchair, playing with her stuffed bear, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. I could see the moment Karen's eyes locked onto my daughter. She was sizing her up, looking at her like an object to be manipulated, a piece of property to be controlled. Without a word, Karen pulled out the chain from her bag and with a swift motion locked it around Emma's wheelchair. The metal links clinked in the silence of the video, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Emma didn't even notice at first. She was still lost in her play, her world innocent and free. Karen, however, was not interested in innocence. She was interested in control. The footage was damning. There was no way Karen could spin this. The evidence was there, and it was unambiguous. But what shocked me the most was how easily Karen carried out the act. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. She didn't even look back as she walked away, leaving Emma chained to the fence. It was as if Emma's presence didn't matter at all to her, as if she was nothing more than a nuisance to be dealt with. I couldn't stop the tears that welled up in my eyes. The rage, the pain, it was all there, right in front of me, and all I could do was watch. But watching wasn't enough anymore. I had to act. The next step was obvious. I had to make sure that Karen faced the consequences for what she had done. And not just her. The HOA, the neighbors, and anyone else who had turned a blind eye to her actions needed to understand the gravity of what had happened. It wasn't just about Emma. It was about the power dynamics that allowed someone like Karen to get away with such behavior for so long. I took a deep breath and made the decision to file an official complaint with the HOA. This time, it wasn't going to be swept under the rug. I wasn't going to be silenced. Emma wasn't going to be silenced. I knew that this would be a fight, but I was ready for it. I sat down at my desk and typed out a letter, detailing everything that had transpired, from the initial encounter to the moment Karen chained Emma to the fence. I made sure to include every piece of evidence that I had, including the security footage and witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen's actions. I was thorough. I wanted to make sure there was no room for doubt. The next morning, I hand-delivered the complaint to the HOA office. The moment I walked through those doors, I felt the weight of the situation settle over me. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a bored expression, took the letter without a word. But as she looked down at it, her eyes widened slightly, and I could see the faintest hint of recognition cross her face. "You're filing a complaint against Karen?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded. "Yes, this can't go on any longer." She didn't respond immediately, but I saw the tension in her face. There was something about the way she handed me a form to sign that felt off. I couldn't quite place it, but I sensed that this wasn't the first time someone had come forward with a complaint against Karen. I had to wonder how many people had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the repercussions. "Don't worry," she said after a long pause. "The board will look into it." I left the HOA office with a sense of purpose, but also an undercurrent of unease. I knew that I was standing up for what was right, but I also knew that I had a long road ahead of me. Karen wasn't going to back down easily, and neither were the people who had turned a blind eye to her actions. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had been silent for years started to come forward one by one, recounting their own experiences with Karen's behavior. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before now felt empowered. The stories were all too similar. There were reports of Karen threatening families with fines for the most trivial of offenses. A mailbox that was an inch too high, a garden that wasn't perfectly trimmed, a child's bike left out in the driveway. The HOA had become a weapon in her hands, and she had used it to terrorize anyone she deemed beneath her. But now, with the weight of the evidence behind me, I could feel the shift. It wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. People were starting to take notice, and for the first time in a long while, Karen's grip on the neighborhood seemed to be loosening. The HOA called an emergency meeting to address the growing concerns. It was clear that they could no longer ignore the issue, not with the evidence that had been presented. I received an invitation to attend, and though I felt a sense of unease in the pit of my stomach, I knew I had to be there. The meeting was held in the HOA's community center, a small building that sat at the edge of the neighborhood. As I walked in, I noticed the tension in the air. There was a sense of anticipation, as if everyone knew that something major was about to happen. I spotted a few familiar faces in the crowd, neighbors I had spoken to, others I had never met, but who had reached out to share their own stories. It was a mix of emotions in the room: fear, anger, hope, and determination. Karen sat at the front, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiance. She wasn't used to being challenged, not in this way. She had always been the one calling the shots, the one who held the power. But today was different. The board began the meeting by reading through the formal complaints. One by one, they listed the grievances against Karen, detailing the ways in which she had abused her position as HOA president. When it came time to address the incident with Emma, the room fell silent. Karen's expression darkened, but she didn't say a word. She knew she was cornered. It wasn't long before the board voted to remove Karen from her position as president. She was forced to step down, and the fallout continued. The charges of harassment against her were filed, and a formal investigation was launched. As I left the meeting, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't over yet, but it was a major step in the right direction. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over the situation again, but I knew that this wasn't just about one woman's downfall. It was about the message it sent, that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could get away with hurting others, that justice would prevail, and that Emma, my beautiful daughter, would never be chained again. The tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. The whispers that had once been quiet and fragmented, were now deafening. People who had remained silent for so long began to speak out. each of them sharing their own experiences, their own grievances with Karen. The woman who had once been the proud, untouchable president of our HOA was no longer the woman we feared. She was a woman backed into a corner, her power crumbling beneath the weight of the evidence that had piled up against her. Karen had always been the kind of person who demanded respect through fear. For years, she had made the rules, and the rest of us had been expected to follow them without question. The HOA was her kingdom, and we were all simply subjects in her eyes. It wasn't until she had crossed the line with my daughter Emma that I realized just how deep the rot ran. Her actions had forced people to step forward, to finally break their silence, and to expose the tyranny she had imposed upon us all. As the day of the emergency HOA meeting approached, I could feel a sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. This meeting was going to change everything, but I couldn't help but feel nervous. The thought of confronting Karen in front of the entire neighborhood, the thought of putting all the evidence out in the open, felt overwhelming. And yet, I knew it had to be done. For Emma, for the neighborhood, and for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, just a few days after the neighborhood had been abuzz with news of the complaint. The HOA had sent out formal invitations, and everyone was expected to attend. I knew that the stakes were high. This wasn't just about Emma and me anymore. This was about holding Karen accountable, about ensuring that no one else would ever have to experience what we had. I arrived early, wanting to get a seat near the front so I could see everything clearly. As I walked into the small community center, I saw that the room was already filling up with familiar faces. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before were now coming together, united by one common goal: to stand up to Karen and her oppressive ways. Some people whispered in hushed tones, others exchanged nods of solidarity. I felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't alone. Karen, of course, had arrived early as well. She sat at the front of the room, her posture as stiff as ever. She had always carried herself like she was above everyone else, like the rules didn't apply to her. But tonight, I could see that the confident, smug expression she wore so often had been replaced with one of tension. She knew that the walls were closing in around her. I took my seat and waited for the meeting to begin. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. People were nervous, yes, but they were also angry. The board members trickled in one by one, and soon the room was filled with the hum of voices. I couldn't help but notice that the board members, the very people who had once allowed Karen to wield such power unchecked, were now avoiding eye contact with her. Their faces were tense, their brows furrowed in worry. It was clear that they knew this was no ordinary meeting. The meeting finally began, and the chairperson, a middle-aged man named Greg, stood up and cleared his throat. His voice cracked slightly as he addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Greg said, his voice shaky but determined. "As you all know, we've called this emergency meeting to address serious allegations that have been brought to our attention regarding the actions of our former HOA president, Karen Thompson." I could feel the room collectively hold its breath. Karen's name had been said out loud, and I could sense the weight of that single moment. This was it. The point of no return. "Several complaints have been filed against Karen," Greg continued, his voice gaining strength. "And after reviewing the evidence, the board believes it is important that we address this issue openly. This isn't just about the rules. This is about something much deeper. The safety, well-being, and dignity of our neighbors." Karen shifted in her seat, but her eyes never left Greg. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but I could see the way her fingers tightened around the armrests of her chair. Her pride, her sense of superiority, was crumbling with every word Greg spoke. Greg went on to outline the complaints that had been made against Karen. They were many, too many to ignore. Neighbors had come forward describing how Karen had used her position as HOA president to intimidate, bully, and harass anyone she deemed an inconvenience. There were stories of fines for the smallest infractions, of threats to take people to court over matters that should have been trivial. But the most shocking of all was the complaint from Emma and me. The incident where Karen had chained my daughter to a fence, all in the name of enforcing a nonsensical rule about the proximity of the sidewalk to the property line. I watched as Karen's face reddened. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, Greg held up his hand. "We've also gathered evidence," he said, his voice firm. "Security footage, witness statements, and photographic evidence all point to the fact that Karen's actions were not just a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. They were deliberate, and they were harmful. There is no denying what happened." I could feel the weight of those words settle over the room. The evidence was irrefutable. No matter how much Karen tried to defend herself, the facts were clear. She had abused her position for far too long, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. It was Karen's turn to speak, and she did not hold back. She stood up, her back straight, and addressed the room with the same air of arrogance that she had always worn like armor. "I have been the HOA president for years," she began, her voice cold and condescending. "I have worked tirelessly to keep this neighborhood in line. I've enforced the rules for the greater good of everyone here. And now, you're all turning on me because of one incident, one mistake?" Her eyes scanned the room, daring anyone to speak up. "It wasn't just one mistake, Karen," a voice from the back of the room called out. "It was Mr. Walker, a neighbor who lived down the street. It's a pattern of abuse. We've all seen it. You've bullied us for years, and now you're trying to justify it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't respond. She knew she was losing control. "You may have thought you were above the law," Greg continued, "but the truth is, you've hurt people. You've hurt children, and that's something that can't be overlooked." Karen's face twisted with fury, but she knew it was over. There was no way to spin her actions. The evidence spoke for itself, and the room had turned against her. She had lost. The board voted swiftly, and it was unanimous. Karen was immediately removed from her position as HOA president. There was no hesitation, no further debate. Her time had come. She had been exposed for who she truly was. A woman who used her power to control and intimidate others without regard for the harm she caused. As the board members continued their deliberations, Karen stood there for a moment. Her shoulders slumped, her expression one of defeat. She tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. No one was listening to her anymore. It was over. The room erupted into applause. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out for years were now clapping, some of them even standing in their seats. The energy in the room shifted from one of tension to one of relief. The oppressive weight that Karen had placed on this neighborhood for so long was finally lifting. I turned to look at Emma, who was sitting beside me, her small hand gripping mine. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but I could see the joy in her eyes. She could feel it too, the sense that we were finally free, that we were no longer under the thumb of someone who had no right to control us. As the meeting came to a close, people began to file out of the room. There was a sense of lightness in the air, as if a storm had passed and the sun was finally breaking through the clouds. But as I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift from my chest. I wasn't just free from Karen's grip. The whole neighborhood was free. And that freedom, that sense of justice, was something we had all fought for together. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and with it, a new chapter began. One where our voices could no longer be silenced. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. As Emma and I walked home, hand in hand, I knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would have its challenges, but we would face them together. We were stronger now, and we would never let anyone take that away from us again. The chains had been broken, and we were finally free. Join the movement and share your story with the HOA Stories, where your voice matters.